So good day. Our subject for today is genetics, and we'll be talking about the basics of it. So genetics is the field of science that examines how traits are passed from one generation to the next. So it usually affects everything about every living thing on Earth. An organism's genes, snippets of DNA that are the fundamental units of heredity, controls also how the organism looks, behaves, and even reproduces. Because all biology depends on genes, understanding genetics as a foundation for all other life sciences, including agriculture and medicine, is critical. So in the picture here, you can clearly see that the nurse said that the baby looks just like his father. So it could be a joke for other people, but this is generally how your genetics works, your genes work. The baby will not exactly look like the father, but maybe once the baby grows, they will have resemblance. That's because of the genes that the baby has inherited from his parents. So it's an exaggerated example, but still, it's a good example. So subdivisions of your genetics. We have your classical Mendelian, wherein it's a discipline that describes how physical characteristics or traits are passed along from one generation to another. Next is you have your molecular genetics, which is the study of the chemical and physical structures of DNA, its close cousin RNA, and your proteins. So molecular genetics also covers how genes do their jobs. So depending on the gene, it has its own function. As for your population genetics, it's a division of genetics that looks at the genetic makeup of larger groups. So most of the time, when we talk about genes and genetics, we only look at certain individuals, okay, not in a group. But if it's population genetics, they look in a larger group instead, or probably a population, or a clan, or even to an extent, for example, even countries. What's the difference between this country and this country in terms of their appearances? Okay, because they could also have their similarities and differences depending on where they are. So next is your quantitative genetics. It's a highly mathematical field that examines the statistical relationship between genes and the traits that they encode. So probably the probability chances of that are related to genes, like how much percent probability that you can get such condition or characteristic or trait depending on your gene. So classical genetics, transmitting traits from generation to generation. It's a common saying here in the Philippines that you got that from your auntie, you got that from your uncle, you got that from your great-great-grandfather or great-grandmother. They always have someone that they can compare it to, or that they can pinpoint it to, that you got that certain characteristic or trait from that person. Okay, because we sometimes think that our distant relatives should not have any influence on how we act or how we look if we go deeper in the genetic level. But we have to be aware that if they are indeed our relative, direct relative, okay, they could have gotten those traits from our ancestors, and that it manifested on them and also on you. That's how you were able to get both the characteristics or traits. I mean, that's how you get the same as them, even though they are a distant relative, but a direct relative. So it's a little bit confusing, but if you analyze it, okay, it actually makes sense. Because if we will be going with the Bible, we all came from just two person. So chances are we have a trait that we could have gotten from someone else, that our relative has gotten that trait also from that same person. Okay, so one very prominent and famous person in this field in genetics is Gregor Mendel, which is a humble monk and a part-time scientist. And he actually founded the entire discipline of genetics. So Mendel was a gardener with an insatiable curiosity to go along with his green thumb. So he's a good gardener. Okay? So his observations may have been simple, but his conclusions were jaw-droppingly elegant. So he was able to use simple examples, okay, but were able to get extreme or very useful information from those simple experiments. So Gregor Mendel is considered to be the father of your genetics. Father of genetics. He used pea plants to study the inheritance of traits. So how is that? So you have our seeds. You have the seeds that are either round or wrinkled ripe. You have your yellow or green seeds. You have purple or white petals, and so on. So he used the different characteristics that he sees or that he saw from his samples. For example, if you use a green seed or a yellow seed, what color would be your produce be? Okay, so if you have your purple petals, what would be the outcome of it? Or yeah, things like that. Or even if whether there will be shorter or longer stems, if those have offsprings, what would they produce? So it's a very simple experiment, but he was able to get so many information from that. So to explain it, okay, so a tall pea plant is crossed with a short pea plant. So in this case, we'll be using the capital letters T and the lowercase t, small letters t, depending on whether it's tall or short. So offspring gets one gene for a given trait, like tallness, from each parent. The different traits do not blend, and the result of this cross is two tall plants. When these two tall plants are crossed, however, the result is three tall plants and one short plant, because tall is a dominant trait and short is a recessive trait. But recessive traits can crop up in later generations if two copies of a recessive gene are present. So in this situation, he was able to conclude that tallness is a dominant trait. So if both parents have that trait, then their offspring will have that trait. Okay. But since it's already the second generation, yeah, because they're the offsprings of their parents, so since they're second generations already, if they breed together, okay, since they already have a tall and a short trait, okay, and with short being recessive and your tall being the dominant one, if they have four offsprings, okay, majority of the offsprings will get the dominant trait. As an example, Okay, it's not always like this at 3:1 ratio. It can be anything, but it's, as a general rule, there is a higher chance for you to actually get the dominant trait. So that's why there's always someone short in the family. Yeah. So for molecular genetics, it's DNA and the chemistry of genes. The area of operations of molecular genetics includes all the machinery that runs cells and manufactures the structures called for by the plants found in genes. So technically your genes, it contains, no? In comparison, a blueprint of a building, and you are the building. How the building looks, how it works, how it will function, and many other more characteristics of a building is incorporated within your blueprint, and genes contains the blueprint. So basically, that's what you are. You are combined traits of your parents. Okay, so it's like both of them wanted to make a building and both of them contributed equally, so you are the result. So the focus of your molecular genetics includes the physical and chemical structures of the double helix or your DNA. So the messages hidden in your DNA, which is your genes, constitute the building instructions for your appearance and everything else about you, from how your muscle functions, how your eyes blink, to your blood type, your susceptibility to particular disease, and everything in between. So the moment that you are conceived, there are already predetermined parameters wherein you will grow, right? For example, you have inherited hypertension from your parents. You will have it since you have already inherited it. It's already predetermined, okay, that you got it. But there's always a chance that you do not get it. That's why whenever we ask our patients, we tell them, is any in your family has any past history with, or currently has hypertension and the likes. So for example, your patient said that both of his parents has hypertension and she doesn't know, or he doesn't know whether he has it, then we should already be cautious that the patient might have it, but it's still undiagnosed. Okay, so like in this picture, so the mother and the father both gives off traits to their child. Like the father's ears were given or were inherited by the child, and as you can see, the nose wasn't from the mother or from the father. So this could be a recessive gene or recessive trait that the child has gotten from either the mother's parents or the father's parents. Someone from both of them, both of the parents, has that kind of nose, and the child was able to get it. Okay, that's how it is. Also, you can see that the child has also inherited the mother's eyelashes, for example, but the hair color is different from the parents. So the hair color could be from someone else already, from either the father's side or from the mother's side. You can also see that the eyebrows were from the mother also. So just by looking at the child, you can somehow imagine how their parents look like. Similarly, if you look at both parents, you can imagine how their offspring will look like. So you can guess somehow whether an offspring will look good or not. But there's always an exception to these things. Remember, we have the dominant traits and recessive traits. What if, right? What if the child was able to get both from both parents the best qualities or best appearances of his or her parents? Then the offspring might look differently, okay, in terms of their, if you will rate the appearance. Okay, so next is your population genetics. So it's genetics in groups of people or in groups. So population genetics is the study of the genetic diversity of a subset of a particular species. In essence, it's a search for patterns that help describe the genetic signature of a particular group, such as the consequences of travel, isolation from other populations, mating choices, geography, and behavior. Let's go back here. Genetic diversity of a subset of particular species. Let's just focus in the Philippines. Okay, we are a very diverse country. We have a lot of islands, and we can somehow easily differentiate people from Luzon, people from Mindanao, and people from Visayas, depending on how they look, how they walk, how they eat, right? Each island has its own perks and characteristics. That's a good example of how population genetics works. It's their behavior, which is based from their area, geography, right? We also have lots of foreigners here in our country, you know, foreigners going to our country, marrying Filipinos, Filipinas, and having child with them, right? So that's the consequence of travel. So you will be getting their mix of characteristics from their own area. So for example, an American citizen goes to the Philippines, he will be bringing American genes to the Philippines. So offsprings and so on. That's how they were able to give the Philippines, or not give, or that's how mixing of races happens. Okay, and there's also this strange notion that a foreigner and a Filipino or a Filipina will always have a better looking offspring than two Filipinos. A Filipino and a Filipina being together. Okay, so if they compare the offspring, the ones that have foreign blood on there has better appearance. Maybe it's also it's not stigma, something similar like that. Okay, but that's what they believe. And if you will look, somehow it's true, because the showbiz industry is dominated by mixed blood. There's very few pure-blooded Filipinos, or there's really few pure-blooded Filipinos because of the many countries that have colonized our country. No, we're already a good mix of different races. So here, on this example, okay, you have your western deer population, and they actually go to the eastern deer population. So what happens is there will be a mingling of populations, And then the eastern deer population will be combining somehow with the western deer traits. No, it's like getting contaminated. Okay, so if you put water, if you put sugar in the water, it becomes sweet. That's the result of the combination. So for quantitative genetics, it's getting a handle on heredity. So it means that quantitative genetics examines traits that vary in subtle ways and relates those traits to the underlying genetics of an organism. A combination of whole suites of genes and environmental factors controls characteristics like retrieving ability in dogs, egg sizes or number in birds, and running speed in humans. One application of quantitative genetics is determining how heritable, or how much you can inherit a particular trait. So that's one of its determining applications. This measure allows scientists to make predictions about how offspring will turn out based on characteristics of the parent organism. So that's how they got whether it's a dominant recessive trait, or if it's a dominant trait, or if it's a recessive trait. Or like you can say the probability. What's the probability of an individual getting this skin color, this condition, things like that. So here, it's a common dog show. It's a dog show. Example of a dog show. So all of them are the same dogs, right? However, they have subtle differences. Each of them has their own differences, unique to them. And what that is, it's entirely dependent on what the results would be if they will be tested individually. So probably in a population of 100 dogs of the same kind, even same looks, okay, they are still different somewhat. So probably they'll check how many of the dogs can adhere properly to commands, how many of the dogs can hear better, things like that. So they can tabulate the results, and from that they can get your data, the probability of a certain trait getting inherited. So we need to study the basic cell biology because we will be encountering that many times. So genetics and the study of how cells work are closely related. The process of passing genetic material from one generation to the next depends completely on how cells grow and divide. To reproduce, a simple organism such as bacteria or yeast simply copies its DNA through a process called replication and splits into two. But organisms that reproduce sexually, like human beings, go through a complicated dance that includes mixing and matching strands of DNA called recombination, and then halving or half the amount of DNA for special sex cells, allowing completely new genetic combinations for their offsprings. So this is also one thing that makes everyone unique. They are a combination of they are a combination from two different parents. Okay, so you might be brothers and sisters, but you have obvious differences, even though even twins have differences. Okay, so that's how complicated in genes are. So here we use the brown hair and blonde hair with small letter B and capital letter B. So the father has in his genes, okay, both brown hair and blonde hair, even though his hair color is brown. What happens now is the mother has both blonde hair. So there's a very high chance that their offsprings will have either of the hair color, and that's what they got. Okay, the offsprings were able to get. They had two, and one has a brown hair and one has a blonde hair. However, when the daughter having the brown hair married someone else that also has brown hair, they were still able to have an offspring that has a blonde hair. Why? That is because the daughter, okay, this one, was able to inherit the blonde hair trait, but it did not manifest. So it only manifested on her own offspring. That's what I'm telling a while ago, that you can get certain traits or characteristics from someone that is far from your that is still a direct relative of yours but is further down the lane, because somewhere along that road there was a point wherein you came from just one person. So these amazing processes are part of what makes you unique. So come inside your cell, you need to familiarize that, and that's your mitosis, or your cell division, and your meiosis is the production of your sex cells. To appreciate how genetics actually works. For mitosis, you have your process, right? So the mother cell will divide into two daughter cells. So first is they try to replicate, and then they divide, and then now you have your daughter cells. So it's actually a very complicated process, but since we can easily simplify it, no? So your meiosis, however, is much more complicated, and it has its own phases. So it has its telophase, and then prophase 2, metaphase 1, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, and telophase 2. So each of those phases has something happening. Okay, so each of those phases, something is happening within the cell as they divide. So there are two basic kinds of organisms, your prokaryotes and your eukaryotes. So prokaryotes are organisms whose cells lack a nucleus and therefore have DNA floating loosely in the liquid center of the cell. So mostly those are your bacteria. Your eukaryotes are organisms that have a well-defined nucleus to house and protect the DNA, so probably as humans. A nucleus is a compartment filled with DNA surrounded by a membrane. So a prokaryotic cell is a very simple cell compared to a eukaryotic cell. So the number of structures present in your prokaryotic is, in comparison, simpler than the one in your eukaryotic cell. I'm sure by now you have seen the cell so many times already. Okay. So there are cells without a nucleus. Scientists classify organisms composed of cells without nuclei as prokaryotes, which means before nucleus. You are at this very moment covered in and inhabited by millions of prokaryotic cells, which is your bacteria. Not all bacteria are bad. Some bacteria are actually good for your body, and at the same time, they help in maintaining your body in its neutral state. So most of the bacteria in your body are completely harmless, but some species of bacteria can be vicious and deadly, causing rapidly transmitted disease such as cholera. All bacteria, regardless of temperament, are simple one-celled prokaryotic organisms. So imagine everything's covered with bacteria. Not unless it's sanitized. Sanitized or sterilized. And even then, there could still be bits and pieces of it bits and pieces of bacteria, but are lowered enough that it will not cause any condition at all. That's why Safeguard says that it kills 99.9% of germs only. It cannot kill everything. So your prokaryotes does not have cell nuclei and are all small cells with relatively small amounts of DNA. But even then, they are extremely dangerous if they are actually the harmful ones. So the exterior of a prokaryotic cell is encapsulated by a cell wall that serves as the bacteria's only protection from the outside world. A plasma membrane or membranes, they would be the thin sheets of layers that regulates the exchange of nutrients, water, and gases that nourishes the bacterial cell. DNA, usually in the form of a single hoop-shaped piece, floats around inside the cell. Segments of DNA like this one are called chromosomes. So the liquid interior of the cell is called your cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm provides a cushiony, watery home for the DNA and other cell machinery that carry out the businesses of living. Prokaryotes divide and thus produce by simple mitosis. So in the picture that you can see, the animation is, you can clearly see that they started as 4, and they are able to multiply by the power of 2 again and again. So you have 4, then you get 8, then you get 16, then you get 32, then 64, and so on and so forth. That's how bacterial infection happens. That's how they spread also. It's fast, and they can do it on their own. So cells with a nucleus. Scientists classify organisms that have cells with nuclei as eukaryotes, which means true nucleus. Eukaryotes range in complexity from simple one-celled animals and plants to complex multicellular organisms like humans. Eukaryotic cells are fairly complicated and have numerous parts to keep track of. Hence, that's the reason why we keep on studying it again and again and again. Eukaryotic cells, like prokaryotes, eukaryotic cells are held together by a plasma membrane. And sometimes a cell wall surrounds the membrane just for plants, for example. But that's where the similarities end. Majority of them are different already. So, unlike prokaryotes, eukaryotes have all sorts of cell parts called organelles that help carry out the business of living. So, one of the most famous part of your cell would be your mitochondria, or the power plant of your cells. So the organelles float around in the watery cytoplasm outside the nucleus. There are two of the most important organelles, and that's one of it, your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of your eukaryotic cell. Mitochondria pumps out energy by converting glucose to ATP, or your sugar, to ATP, or your adenosine triphosphate, which acts like a battery of sorts, storing energy until it's needed for day-to-day living. Both animal and plants have mitochondria. So that's why it's a good example for sugar rush. After eating so many sweets, you get so active and alive, and then after some time you get your it's not like a shock, yeah, it's like your shock, but that's because all of those sudden increase of sugar has already been used up. That's why you get suddenly tired. Next is your chloroplasts. So these organelles are unique to plants. They process the energy of sunlight into sugars that the plant mitochondria use to generate the energy that nourishes the living cells. So it's really nice if you're a plant. You don't need to eat at all. You have your chloroplasts, and that's enough to power you up. It's very cheap being a plant, right? So imagine in the future, if we are able to harness the capability of plants, and humans get their own chloroplasts. You don't have to eat anymore. Okay, so somatic cells. Somatic cells are produced by simple cell division called mitosis. Somatic cells of multicellular organisms like humans are differentiated into special cells. Skin cells and muscle cells are both somatic cells, for instance, but if you were to examine your skin cells under a microscope and compare them with your muscle cells, you'd see that their structures are very different. Yes, they look very different. The various cells that make up your body all have the same basic components, a membrane, an organelle, and so on. But the arrangements of the elements change from one cell type to the next. So they can carry out various jobs such as digestion for your intestinal cells, energy storage for your fat cells, or oxygen transport to your tissues, which is your blood cells. Yes, that's your blood's work, transporting of oxygen. Sex cells. Sex cells are specialized cells used for reproduction. Only eukaryotic organisms engage in sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction combines the genetic material from two organisms, so in our instance, the mother and the father, and requires special preparation in the form of a reduction in the amount of genetic material allocated to sex cells, which the process called is meiosis. In humans, the two types of sex cells are the egg cells and the sperm cells. So in this picture that you can see, okay, the GIF that you can see the small sperm cell entering the very, very big egg cell. And yes, there's only one that can enter. Once it's able to enter, the others I think they just die. Or yeah, once it's claimed, nothing's gonna happen anymore. But majority of the time, only one sperm cell can. It takes just one sperm cell to fertilize an egg cell. And during sex, you are able to release millions if you're healthy. Basic chromosomes. Chromosomes are thread-like strands composed of DNA. To pass genetic traits from one generation to the next, the chromosomes must be copied, and then the copies must be divvied up. Most prokaryotes have only one circular chromosome that, when copied, is passed on to the daughter cell or the new cells created by your cell division during mitosis. Eukaryotes have more complex problems to solve, like divvying up half of the chromosomes to make sex cells. And their chromosomes behave differently during mitosis and meiosis. So sex chromosomes determines the gender. Human cells contains 2 sex chromosomes. If you're a female, you have 2 X chromosome, and if you're male, you have 1 X and 1 Y. It's easy to know because Y has its, that. Autosomal chromosomes simply refers to non-sex chromosomes. Sticking with the human example, if you do the math, you can see that humans have 44 autosomal chromosomes. So this would be your karyotypes or chromosomes. So you have 22 autosomal pairs and 1 sex chromosome pair. So in this picture, it's a guy. It's a male person because you have your X and Y. Okay. So the issue here is any problems with any of your chromosomes, one of which the most common would be your 21. There's just 2 of them. There's supposed to be a pair. But if you add 1 more in your chromosome number 21, you already have a problem. Okay? Depending on the condition or what happens, you will have a problem. Or any deviation from the normal will result to abnormal. So basics of chromosomes. The part of the chromosomes that appears pinched, located in the middle of the chromosome, is called your centromere. So all of them has their centromeres. The placement of the centromere, whether it's closer to the top, middle, or bottom of the chromosome, is what gives each chromosome its unique shape. That's how they are able also to determine which chromosome is which. The ends of the chromosomes are called your telomeres. Telomeres are made of densely packed DNA and serve to protect the DNA message that the chromosome carries. So they protect it so that they are able to transfer it or transmit it, or for the body to actually utilize the DNA. So the differences in shapes and sizes of chromosomes are easy to see, but the most important differences between chromosomes are hidden deep inside the DNA. Chromosomes carry genes or sections of DNA that make up the building plans for physical traits. So how you look. The genes tells the body how, when, and where to make all the structures that are necessary for the processes of living. Each pair of homologous chromosomes carries the same but not necessarily identical genes. As you can see, the genes tells the body how, when, and where to make all the structures that are necessary for the process of living. This also means that they are the ones that are involved in triggering certain cells in your body to start producing or to stop producing or to even induce apoptotic cell death or programmed cell death. The reason why you do not grow anymore past a certain age is because of this. That's one of the things that happens in our body. Okay? So for example, both chromosomes of a particular homologous pair may contain the gene for hair color, but one can be a brown hair version of the gene. Alternative versions of the genes are called alleles, and the other can be a blonde hair allele. Okay, so this is one way for you to determine the traits that you are able to inherit. Okay, so you might be able to get these traits, but they did not manifest. Okay, so that's the example I've been giving again and again.